Hey guys, this is Mike Wolf. Welcome to the Spoon Podcast. I am on the road this week recording this intro on an iPhone in Fort Morgan, Alabama. But I wanted to get this podcast out on the RSS feed because it was a lot of fun talking to Ralph Fritsche, who is head of growth systems for NASA for long-term space travel. As you guys probably know if you read the Spoon or you listen to the podcast, I'm kind of a space food nerd. Not really sure why. Maybe it's a childhood interest in space travel, connecting with my now fascination with food and every aspect of it. And so this was a really interesting conversation as we talk through where NASA is with its space travel food program. We talk about some of the terrestrial applications here on Earth and how we can use some of the innovation by some of the companies and some of the startups that have been participating in the Deep Space Food Challenge. And we talk about lots of other things as well. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. We'll be back next week with another one. Talk to you soon. All right, well, this is going to be a really fun conversation. One of my favorite topics in food tech to talk about is this idea of how do we ultimately feed people in space? And we couldn't have a better person on the podcast today than Ralph Fritsche. First of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And you are with NASA, and I think your official title is Senior Project Manager for Spacecraft Production and Exploration Food Systems in support of deep space. Is that it? How do you tell people? What do you tell people at a party you do for NASA?
That's always a challenge. I basically, that is the current titles that I have next to my name. I basically tell them that I'm working to figure out ways and methodologies to feed crews on long distance exploration missions. And, part of that is the prepackaged food system that we've kind of been using for decades now, but then it's how do I do things sustainably and provide fresh food to supplement that prepackaged food.
By the way, like at any party, you'd be the guy you wouldn't want to like come up against when you're like trying to compare cool jobs. Like if I tell someone I'm an accountant and you come back and tell me you're feeding people in space, I think that's just way cooler just generally. So you usually win that battle.
I don't know. Sometimes people either walk away because it's too complicated and they don't want to hear about it, or I'm stuck talking about it for hours. It's one of the two.
Yeah, it's either or. There's probably no in between. But well, I do want to talk about it and kind of talk about the Deep Space Food Challenge, which is something that NASA has been working on for a while. But before we get into all of that, Ralph, how did you end up working for NASA? Like, is this something that like a lot of kids, you were interested in space as a kid, and you just ultimately kind of moved that way? How did that happen?
The irony is, yes, I was interested in space as a kid, but I never really thought about it being a career, so to speak. I was more interested in astronomy and space sciences. I think what led me to working for NASA is that my parents moved to the east coast of Florida right when I was starting college, and not really being sure as to what I wanted to do with my college experience, I decided to come down here, join them, and go to school at what was known then at the time Florida Institute of Technology. Now it's Florida Tech. And working and studying in the space sciences organization. But then after you graduate, you're kind of trying to figure out what do you do for a job? How do you make money with this degree? And with the Space Center being right there, a lot of the folks that I had gone to school with were working out there for the Space Center early on in the Space Shuttle program. And so I got a position out there and I was working on Space Shuttle payloads. More from a electrical engineering and integration perspective on payloads that went into the Space Shuttle orbiter. And then that parlayed through the entire Space Shuttle program, got to work a lot of interesting missions, but generally speaking, you were a small cog in a big wheel. You'd have a major interplanetary payload come through. You had Hubble Space Telescope, for example, come through, and you were basically just integrating it into the orbiter with a series of known interfaces that you'd worked with time and time again. You really didn't design the payload, but it was a fun job. You got to work a lot of different projects. Then we got to the point where we were kind of done flying payloads in the space shuttle that were not related to the space station. So then it turned over to space station assembly. And I moved into operations, was one of the test directors working on the space station assembly aspect of things. And then, you get to the point where space station is built now. So now what do you do next? And so the logical progression is that my parent organization, NASA, turned into utilization of the space station. So we built it. Now, how do we use it?
Huh.
And a lot of that has to do with the different science experiments that are done on board. And my group kind of morphed into the life sciences area, biological payloads. So I was working on developing and flying payload experiments that would, be operated and run on the International Space Station. And then up next in the rotation, after I'd gotten done with the previous payload, was this idea of crop production, space crop production. And it was floated by one of our stakeholders, really didn't know what it meant. We had a lot of life science people working, or a number of life science people working in my organization, but there were probably just as many engineers and project managers. It was a small group of people, no more than 15 or 20. Yeah. And so I kind of started from the ground floor, not really knowing anything about growing crops in space. At that time, we weren't really thinking so much in the day-to-day world about feeding astronauts.
On the calendar, when was this, just generally year-wise?
This was probably about 10 years ago now.
Okay. So about the past decade, you've been focused on this.
Yes. We were focused mainly about the research, the fundamental research of how would crops perform in that spaceflight environment. And there had been things done in the past, on different space shuttle payloads had payloads for that. The Russian space program worked a little bit early on space station with some hardware as well, but it was still a new field, and we were still trying to come to terms with how do you provide water and nutrients to the root zone of plants in microgravity environment when water behaves a lot differently there. How do you either have plants suffocating from being immersed in too much water or just not having access to any water? And that was the real challenge, and that was the real focus, and was learning about how do the plants perform at a fundamental cellular level. And it was only probably in the past 4 or 5 years, I would say maybe a little bit longer than that. Time seems to get away from me. But we actually started growing some leafy greens that astronauts could consume, a portion of what we grew. We had to work to get that approved from a food safety perspective for the astronauts. And then that kind of set the bit that, when we start talking about exploration missions, the prepackaged food system that we've relied on for so long, for these long duration missions, 2 to 4 years total length, depending on what we're doing.
And that's all the food. All food that goes into space now for long-term travel is like packaged on Earth, right?
Yes, and even the plants that we grow in space now are pre-planted on Earth. They're not necessarily imbibed or watered yet, but the seeds are planted. So that along with that is this big tectonic shift in thought. When I look at the food system that we've used since the dawn of the space program, we've always shipped things up. Had the astronauts bring it with them early days. Now with space station, we have resupply missions. The food that we send up, it's really, 3 basic aspects for what we currently feed the astronauts on the space station. It's that prepackaged food that predominantly consists of thermostabilized meals, highly nutritious, flavorful, enjoyable. Freeze-dried foods are still there. And that's the bulk of the diet, but they also get fresh fruits and vegetables at resupply. But again, there's no real way to store or preserve those, so those things are consumed fairly quickly after they arrive. And then the third aspect are like the kind of crew preference items. So each crew member has the ability to, have certain things sent up that will be kind of like a psychosocial benefit to them, some behavioral benefit.
They can order pizza. Is what you're saying.
Good. When they get a chance to make a pizza, they're very happy. So you take that way of thinking that we've been doing business with for a long time, and now you have to factor on that you're not going to have resupply. You're likely not going to necessarily even have crew preference items if you have to pre-position any of this food. And the food begins to, start to lose efficacy of certain key vitamins and nutrients after about 18 months. So what do you do? And the deep space food challenge comes into that a little bit. But, the way we're looking at now is we have the most experience growing plants in space. And those plants that we look towards now are really things that are pick and eat type of plants. So crops like leafy greens, fruiting crops,
Yeah.
peppers,
Yeah.
tomatoes we're working with. We don't have the ability to do processing and preparation yet. That'll be later on when we start setting up, semi-permanent or permanent outposts on the moon or Mars.
Everything you're working on is becoming in greater focus because you say there was a monumental shift in thinking from this kind of first world of prepackaged preference items
Right.
and such to now there's a new thinking. There's long-term space travel. We can't do resupply. We're going to have to grow food in space because we'll need it, also because it's probably healthier over the long term. Like,
it supplies certain nutrients that are going to degrade over time. So, the longer that they're away from home, that's probably when they're going to need to be sure that they're getting the best diet that they can, because they're going to be subject to this deep space environment for that long. And that's the point in time where the food system will start degrading. So you really have to figure out a way to keep the astronauts healthy and operating at peak performance. And that's where supplemental food production comes in. And the dawn of that, the beginning of that is really in the crop world. The other aspect that will eventually lace into this, hopefully in a nice, smooth, and timely manner in the future, is Earth independence and sustainability off Earth. And that's where you're going to start when you have those longer-term presence on the moon and Mars. You're going to be talking about how do I start producing food independent of Earth as much as possible, using in situ resources and trying to figure out how to get a closed loop bioregenerative life support, system going there, with food being, one of the central tenets of it.
all right. So when we talk about long-term space travel and feeding people in space, there's going to be a completely different way we approach it in terms of like, we have to grow food. Maybe there's new food creation systems, which we got a preview of some of those with the Deep Space Food Challenge phase 2 finalists.
Right.
Can you tell people first about the Deep Space Food Challenge, like why NASA and the Canadian Space Agency decided to do this?
Yeah, I think it's evolved over time. I think the original concept was we have folks at the Johnson Space Flight Center who've spent parts of their career looking to see what food technologies were on the forefront and emerging, to see what are some things we could leverage and potentially bring with us to spaceflight application. So we thought we had done a pretty good job of canvassing, where things were technology-wise across the world, actually. And as just a final check, they said, let's go ahead and see if we have missed anything. What's the best way to go about that? So NASA has this Centennial Challenge program, which is a great motivational challenge that lets people, organizations from across the world participate at certain levels. And the goal was to see, was there anything we're missing? Are there any new technologies that may have been focused more terrestrially speaking, that hadn't really made a connection with NASA, things that we may have missed, just to be sure we captured everything? And that's how the Deep Space Food Challenge kind of really began. So it's been going on now. We're in phase 2 of that challenge. The finalists, as you said, were announced for our tabletop demonstration. So we started with a bunch of teams, both U.S.-based teams and international teams. We've whittled that down to 8 finalists for phase 2 for the tabletop, U.S., and 3 international. The U.S. teams get prizes. The international ones don't necessarily get prizes. We also, along the way, partnered with the Canadian Space Agency, and their interest was similar to ours, but had a little different slant. They're very concerned about how do they get the proper nutrition to the Indigenous people in the Northwest Territories of Canada, where it's difficult to provide them with a healthy, balanced diet. So they're looking for approaches that they could actually use terrestrially as well. And so they have a slightly different set of rules for their portion of the challenge, but we are sharing the data with the winners. And so the beauty of it is, even if a team doesn't win, and a certain team may not win a different phase of the challenge simply because their idea hasn't been developed quite sufficiently enough, or just because we don't see the near-term pathway for inclusion for that type of concept into what we're doing, but that at least brings them up to our radar. So we always have the opportunity of partnering with them to do some additional development work. And you may see that happen with teams that did not win one of the steps of the challenge, but where NASA does have an interest and they're looking to put some type of collaboration in place to kind of further develop things. But right now oh, go ahead.
Was your role with this? Were you a judge, or were you kind of guiding as an advisor? What was your role for the?
Both. I was kind of one of the founders of determining the rules for the challenge, the rationale behind the challenge, and I've stayed on to be one of the subject matter experts and judges in the plant growth category of the challenge. So yeah, I've kind of been riding herd on it from the beginning, and I think we kind of had our first real meeting to lay a formulation for the challenge before it was ever approved back probably late 2018. So this has been ongoing for a while. And yeah, so now we're at the point of actually doing the judging for the tabletop demonstration. One of the big issues that was a factor for everybody in this round of the competition was the emphasis on food safety. And I think as we've started even just looking at how do we grow plants in space operationally in support of missions continuously, the food safety angle is something that probably hasn't over time had enough attention. So we're really focusing on that. And in part, this is where, what we've done in the past, we've been very close with the controlled environment agriculture community because we kind of seeded them in some ways, and now we get back information from them in some ways and technologies that they use. And we kind of trying to understand the best practices from a controlled environment agriculture perspective, because a lot of those are going to be similar to things that we need to incorporate on spaceflight. And so challenge teams who are coming into the Deep Space Food Challenge, they were probably a lot like how the NASA engineers were a decade ago. They were figuring out the different ways you can actually grow and produce food, but they weren't necessarily food safety scientists. And so how do you maintain a system and run it and keep the outputs and the healthy and the systems operational is a whole new paradigm that we're just now getting into.
Well, looking at the companies that made the final, and I looked at the companies, all the companies and entrants before this, there's just a ton of really interesting ideas. And if I were to kind of characterize what I'm seeing is like companies that built systems that can work in really tough environments with minimal resources, et cetera, and make food safely in the harshest of environments. And what's interesting with the final 8, a lot of them are focused on fungi-based food production. I imagine there's a reason for that. Maybe fungi is.
That's very interesting that you mentioned that and bring that up, because the group that I work with at Kennedy Space Center really plant scientists, but when you looked at the challenge winners that have come forward, a lot of them are incorporating fungi with plants in kind of closed loop systems where the fungi are taking the inedible biomass from the plants. They're taking they're putting off CO2 so that the plants can consume. So they're kind of like closing that cycle there. And for the future, that's a big thing. They're trying to really make the most of what they take with them. And that's very important for us in spaceflight. So that's actually kind of had our group thinking that we really need to start bringing in expertise in the area of fungi and mycelium into our group and kind of putting our hands around that too. We have not done that yet, but that's something that just from the way the challenge is playing out seems to be a viable area for us to expand to. We do have contacts at the university level we've talked about, but we really don't have any fungi experts, I would say, in my organization at this point in time. So that's something that may be changing in the near future.
Yeah. I think there's 2 other companies that are building systems that create food out of CO2.
Yeah.
One is Air Company. They basically make alcohol out of the carbon dioxide captured from the breath of astronauts. And another company we've written about because Solar Foods has been out there beyond just this program. They use gas fermentation to produce protein essentially from thin air. But this idea of like, hey, how do we take things like CO2 and use that as an input to create food makes a lot of sense in a space environment.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned Solar Foods. It just so happens that's one of the 2 international teams that I'm going to be going over and judging. And part of that is that is a novel technology, and it's the kind of thing that Solar Foods in particular seems to have a business model where they're actually producing a product, looking to manufacture it on a large scale and incorporate it in the food system. Being in the European sector, it's a very green thinking organization in a green sector of how the world chooses to look at food and sustainability. So I'll be going over there to just try to understand, not only the concept that they're working with and how well their submission is, but to seeing how do I potentially begin to think about applying something like that into a future spaceflight mission. So that is, on the extreme novel aspect of things, definitely not something that we're going to be putting on a Mars transit vehicle when we first head off to Mars, but it's something that likely will, in one shape or form, make its way onto a surface setting in the future.
Well, the Canada interest is not that different than what we've seen in Japan with their efforts to develop space food. They want to use some of this innovation to apply terrestrially, and I could see something like Solar Foods working in that kind of northern Canadian region where it is hard to produce food, but if you can use this type of technology to make food out of CO2, it makes a lot of sense in kind of tough environments here on Earth.
Yeah, and that's very true, and there's definitely a desire by NASA as well as CSA to look for terrestrial applications. I think when I stick with my NASA hat on, I'm schooled very well by the folks at the Johnson Space Flight Center as to the kind of things a food system should have. And they really look for not only the nutritional aspect of what is possible, but also the desirability and what that type of food consumption is going to mean psychologically for crews on space missions. And part of that is the desirability and the palatability of what we actually provide crews. It's been shown by a lot of the longer duration ISS flights to the International Space Station that over time astronauts suffer from menu fatigue, kind of like even people today terrestrially on Earth. I mean, unlike my son who could have eaten chicken fingers every day of his life when he was growing up, I think that as people get older, they start to get tired of certain things if they're given them consistently over time. And even it's been shown that, crews' taste buds seem to change somewhat over time. So it's really important that we figure out ways to make food enjoyable. And it's not good enough, in other words, to just make this wonderful product that'll meet all the nutritional requirements that an astronaut has, but it to be something that is bland or not flavorful. We have to look just as closely at the psychological benefit that having food provides. And you can think about that everything from, just needing something quickly while you're in the middle of a very busy task to give you energy, to something that is an enjoyable, almost celebratory meal that, you can gather with fellow crewmates at the end of maybe a successful operation or a period of time and sit down and share a meal at the end of the day, something that's probably getting all too unfamiliar to our Western culture. And then even then, there's also the case where, hey, this is just a meal that is a reward for something. So, we have to make sure that the food system and the components that we provide to astronauts can fit all those psychological aspects as too. I remember seeing 2001: A Space Odyssey when I was a kid, and he was just eating this bland meal with a plastic fork. And how many days in a row would you want to do that? So,
well, speaking of like movies and kind of, there is, I think, a lot of influence in our thinking around because of science fiction. And one of the things that I've thought about the last couple of years is this idea of like the food replicator. And there's actually a startup out there called Canna that took a lot of influence from the Star Trek space food replicator, where they're taking molecules and kind of doing it essentially what they're calling a drink printer. Do you think this idea, if we look 30 years in the future, 40 years in the future, we'll be able to essentially print varieties of food, whether that's in space flight or in a long-term kind of situation on the moon or Mars? Are some of these ideas we get from science fiction going to be reality in like if we look at a long enough time horizon?
I think that the key there is looking at a long enough time horizon. I would, not being an expert in the food domain in general, as far as future thinking goes, I would hesitate saying that it's impossible. I don't see the practical pathway to getting there now. I think that when you look at a lot of the different concepts out there for, cellular biology, trying to make meat and replicate it, and you see this little product on a plate that may be cooked and prepared and looks appetizing or enough to be something familiar to you, but there's usually a back room with a ton of infrastructure in there and processes that need to be tweaked and maintained. And so I think we're just far down the road now to say what exactly is going to actually pan out in the end. So my hope would be that we would get there. My hope is that even for what we do in the crop world is we want to be able to have astronauts or crew members interact with these systems in a way that they find enjoyable. We don't want them to become, slave to the process and have this to be another thing on their task list to do that may not be all that beneficial psychologically. So automation in everything we're doing and is an important aspect of things. Even in the crop world, our goal is to try to automate as much as possible of the process, but to allow astronauts to engage where and when they can. So things like harvesting plants might be highly enjoyable task, but things like cleaning up and getting rid of the inedible biomass at the end of an operation may not be. So, I think we have to factor that in too. A replicator might be great, but they might want to sit around and cook a good, plate of pasta at the end of the day too.
Yeah. That idea of like not making the job too hard on that of the astronauts. You don't want to make them have to be like chefs and sous chefs and food preparers. You just want to get them nutrition. That makes a lot of sense. When we look at long-term setting up camps on place like the moon or Mars, it seems like a lot of your focus is on the travel part. But are you guys thinking about like, hey, we're going to set up shop here, someone's going to live on Mars for 5, 10 years or permanently? Are you guys thinking about that yet, or is that down the road?
So interestingly enough, while we're going to be returning to the surface of the moon before we ever make the trek out to Mars, the first real need for supplemental food, and so that's where I come in the crop world, is on that transit mission to Mars because of the long duration associated with it. Early missions to the moon are going to be relatively short in duration. The prepackaged food system will well cover that. So from a timeline perspective, it's really that mission to Mars that'll be the first place we need to look at supplementing the crew diet. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not looking at surface systems applications. It's just there's a whole lot of work with the surface architecture that's got to be put there foundationally in place before we even think of talking about having missions that are long enough surface days where bringing the infrastructure to grow, prepare, and do that kind of food work is going to be feasible. Might be counterintuitive when you think of it.
So like the timelines we're talking about, like really, we're talking still decades in terms of the planning for you guys and kind of when all this stuff happens.
It's one of the interesting things is that we're working very hard right now at the Kennedy Space Center. We're actually in the process of designing and then beginning to build the first operational crop production system. So the things that we've currently have on the International Space Station are the veggie payload. We have 2 of those, and we have the advanced plant habitat. But they were both research facilities. So really, you were bringing the growth media pre-planted, and they were media-based systems, and that stuff was discarded at the end of a research campaign. And then you'd clean out the system, waiting for the next researcher's hardware to come in. So it didn't really reflect an operational approach to growing crops consistently for food. So we're now beginning to build that first system. We're looking to fly it probably by 2025. Keep it on the space station for a while, and we're going to learn enough about that system. What are the inputs? What are the failure modes? Where is the maintenance required? What do we have to do to keep the system clean and running? The food output, safe to eat, so that system is going to become the precursor, hopefully, for what we put on our Mars transit vehicle. We'll learn enough from that to go forward. So that's where our focus is now, and just working on this system to fly it in 2 years, we're thinking ahead to the Mars transit vehicle, which likely isn't going to, head to Mars until the end of the 2030s, the beginning of the 2040s cusp right now. But that system, that vehicle is going to be put in cislunar space around the moon, and it's going to be shaken down. It's going to be outfitted first. It's going to be shaken down for longer duration flights. They're going to use it with the moon as an analog for a Mars mission. So they'll kind of practice what they would have to do to support a Mars mission, but in lunar space, duration, timeline-wise. So even though that's far away, we're at a crunch for developing this system now to deploy to the ISS, so we'll know what we're going to build for the Mars Transit Vehicle. So time is a very interesting factor. While it is way out there, we're in a rush to get started, so we're not late.
Talking about growing food in space is interesting, but what about cooking? I know that there's a product called, I think, the 0G oven, I think, on the ISS right now. There's testing it. Did you work with that? Like, how do you cook food in space using things like heat?
No, I did not work with that, and so my overall knowledge of some of those systems is minimal. But what I can tell you is, right now we don't have a refrigerator or a stove to cook food in space or to store it. If you look back in the history of the space program, probably the thing that would be most similar to what you would potentially look at as a kitchen would have been the systems that we had on Skylab. They actually had a little place to do some cooking and stuff. So the challenge right now is everything is heated up with hot water. Water is a precious commodity as well, so it's not easy. Again, from the infrastructure perspective, especially in my early missions to the moon, you're actually going to see a constraining of the variety and types of foods we can take to the moon just because of the mass constraints we're under. You're not going to have a stove. You're not going to have, you're going to have limited water access for crew to consume. Everything is going to be constrained tightly, on those early missions to the moon. So it's somewhat interesting. We will have, if you look back at the history of the space program, we'll have probably had our brightest time from a kitchen perspective back in the early 70s, and then it's not going to really get better until we start getting to the surface and staying there longer.
Hey, well, this is fascinating. I could talk about space food forever. Ralph, thank you so much for spending time and lending some of your knowledge to this. I really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun.
Sure, anytime.
All right, that was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and that scratched that space nerd itch inside you as much as it did for me. So I want to thank Ralph Fritsche for joining us. All right, that's it from now from Fort Morgan, Alabama. We'll talk to you guys next week.